They mocked his uniform, questioned his license, and shoved him to the ground. Just an old black man driving a bus. What they didn't know was his son wasn't just a soldier. He was the deadliest sniper in Green Beret history. And when the call came in, he didn't ask questions. He just arrived. It was a quiet evening, the city lights flickering faintly through the mist of early autumn. The streets were beginning to empty, the rush of commuters winding down as the night took hold. For most, it was just another shift, another evening, another route. But for the elderly bus driver, it was the same routine that had carried him through decades of labor. His hands were rough, but steady, gripping the wheel with the care of someone who had seen it all. He had worked this same route for nearly 30 years, quietly serving his community. The passengers, most of whom were regulars, knew him well. Some even waved when they boarded, sharing brief pleasantries as they settled into their seats. He wasn't just a bus driver. He was a quiet fixture of the city, someone whose face had become as familiar as the streets themselves. But tonight something felt off. As he navigated the usual path, the streetlights casting long shadows across the road, he noticed a police car trailing him. At first, he didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just making sure the area was safe. But then they followed him for longer than he was used to, staying just behind, always a little too close for comfort. When the flashing lights hit the rearview mirror, his guts sank. He slowed the bus and pulled over, just as he had done 100 times before for every police vehicle that had signaled him in the past. He didn't feel fear. He had been through much worse in his life, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this stop wasn't going to be the usual. The cop car came to a screeching halt behind him, the sound of tires against pavement echoing in the quiet night. 2 officers stepped out, their bodies rigid, their expressions unreadable. The first officer, a tall man with dark hair and a jaw set like stone, approached the driver's side with an air of authority that suggested he had already made his mind up about the situation. The second officer, younger and with a look of impatience, stood by the door, his hand hovering near his weapon, just in case. The elderly man had seen enough to know what this was. The look in their eyes told him they had already decided who he was before they even exchanged words. They had already pegged him as someone who didn't belong. He had lived with that judgment all his life. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his voice sharp. The elderly man's hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he reached for the documents in his glove compartment. It was a simple request, one he had obeyed 1,000 times before. But this time, something in the officer's posture, his tone, set off a quiet alarm inside him. "Sir, everything's in order," the elderly man said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm just finishing my last round for the night." The officer took a long look at him, his eyes scanning the elderly man's face, as if searching for a reason to find fault. There was a beat of silence before the officer spoke again. "You're driving this bus alone?" The words were more of an accusation than a question. The elderly man nodded, maintaining his composure. "Yes, sir, just like I always do." The officer looked down at the bus. Then, without warning, he reached into the window, grabbing the man's papers from his hands. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, his voice cold and authoritative. The elderly man's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his posture calm. He knew what was happening. He had seen it before, though not as openly, not as brazenly. The younger officer moved forward as well, his body language tense, as if anticipating something. But there was no sign of resistance from the elderly man, only a quiet resignation. "What's this all about?" the elderly man asked, his voice carrying a hint of confusion. He had done nothing wrong. He had lived his life by the book, paid his dues, and yet here they were, treating him as if he were a criminal. "Get out of the bus now," the officer repeated, his voice louder this time, more insistent. The elderly man slowly opened the door and stepped out, his joints creaking as he moved. His hands were still raised in a calm gesture, but his mind was racing. What had he done to deserve this? What had he done that made him a target? The younger officer stepped forward, his voice tinged with suspicion. "We're going to need to check your ID. Check the bus." His eyes flicked over the old man's shoulder, scanning the interior of the bus. The tone in his voice suggested that they already expected the worst. The elderly man felt his pulse quicken, though he knew there was no reason for alarm. "This is my bus," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of frustration creeping through. "I've been driving this route for over 25 years. You can check whatever you need to, but there's nothing wrong." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward and opened the door of the bus, looking inside as if expecting to find something, anything, that would justify his actions. The elderly man's stomach churned as the humiliation set in. They were treating him like a criminal, like he had stolen the bus, like he wasn't even worthy of the benefit of the doubt. And it wasn't just the officers. This was how the world had always seen him. It wasn't just about this bus or this night. It was about the way people had always looked at him. Older, black, and invisible unless he was being used as a scapegoat. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that a phone call was already being made, a phone call that would change everything. As the officers continued their interrogation, the elderly man remained silent, allowing the humiliation to wash over him without response. He had long since learned the value of patience in the face of cruelty. His back remained straight, his hands clasped behind his back, though his heart was heavy with an old, familiar burden. The years of racism and prejudice he had endured were nothing new, just another chapter in a lifetime of quiet suffering. His mind wandered as the officers moved about, rifling through his bus, inspecting the engine, as though they expected to find some hidden crime beneath the floorboards. His body may have aged, his joints creaking with every movement, but his mind was sharp. Every word spoken by these officers, every movement they made, felt like a reminder of all the injustice he had witnessed throughout his life. His thoughts weren't of anger, but of sorrow. He had worked hard his entire life, harder than most could even understand. From the moment he dropped out of school to support his family, he'd known that survival wasn't just about getting by. It was about earning respect, even when it wasn't offered. His hands were rough from decades of hard work, calloused by jobs that no one else wanted, jobs that were beneath the pride of the so-called better people of society. But for him, there was no shame in putting in a hard day's work, no matter how menial. He had raised his children with those values. He had always told them, "Your dignity is yours to keep, no matter what the world tries to take from you." But today, as he stood on the side of that bus with two officers, those words seemed so far away. His chest tightened as he remembered his son, his eldest, the one he was most proud of. He had taught him that same lesson about dignity, about standing tall even when the world was determined to bring you low. His son had taken those lessons to heart, becoming not just a successful man, but a force, someone who had done things most men could only dream of. And now he was overseas, far from home. The old man wondered if his son would ever need to hear about this moment, about the way he was being treated by men who had no respect for him, for his life, for the years he had spent contributing to the world around him. But as the officers continued their search, the old man's thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a familiar sound. It was the low hum of a cell phone, vibrating in his coat pocket. A bystander, one of the few remaining passengers who had witnessed the scene unfold, had managed to quietly dial someone powerful. The phone was quickly pressed to the old man's ear, though the officers didn't notice. They were too wrapped up in their own arrogance to notice anything outside of their narrow view. "Dad, it's me." The voice on the other end of the line was calm, reassuring, yet filled with an undercurrent of anger that only a son could carry when his father was wronged. The old man's heart skipped a beat. His son's voice, steady and full of authority, was enough to ease the tension in his chest. He knew that the son he had raised would never tolerate this. He could feel it in the way his son spoke to him, in the way his son had always carried himself through life. "They're treating me like a criminal," the old man said, his voice low but clear. "But I haven't done anything wrong." "Stay calm, Pops. Don't worry," his son replied, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm handling it." The old man didn't need to ask what that meant. His son didn't need to explain. The connection between them, built over years of silent understanding, was enough. The old man closed his eyes for just a moment, allowing himself a small breath of relief. He had raised his son to be the man he was today, and now, for the first time in a long while, He felt the strength of that bond. But even as the phone call ended, he knew this moment wasn't over. The officers were still there, still searching, still poking and prodding into a life that wasn't theirs to judge. He could feel their eyes on him, their suspicion and disdain. Despite the growing tension, the old man's face remained impassive. He had seen far worse than this, had faced far more dangerous situations in his youth. He had faced the violent racism of his earlier years, the threats from men who saw his existence as something less than human. But none of that had broken him. And these officers, as disrespectful and cruel as they were, wouldn't break him either. They could push and prod, accuse and belittle, but the old man knew the truth. He knew who he was. He knew what he had done. And he knew that, in the end, that truth would prevail. He glanced at the passengers who had remained on the bus, watching in silence, some with their phones raised, recording everything. It was a small comfort that these strangers were willing to bear witness to what was happening. It was a sign that the world was changing, slowly but surely. People weren't as willing to turn a blind eye anymore. They were starting to see the injustices others had been facing for so long. The old man took one last look at the officers as they finished their search. He could see the tension in their faces, the uncertainty that had crept in. They weren't sure how to respond to him, not because he was dangerous, but because he was a man who had lived through the worst and still stood tall. He wasn't afraid of them, and that was something they couldn't take from him. But as the officers gave him one last look, the old man's thoughts were no longer with him. They had their answers, or at least they thought they did. He knew something they didn't. His son would be here soon, and when he arrived, everything would change. The heat of the desert sun beat down relentlessly as the sniper adjusted the scope of his rifle, his focus narrowing as he surveyed the terrain. The air was thick with dust. The world around him stretched out in an endless sea of browns and tans, the horizon a blur of shimmering heat waves. His fingers were steady, movements fluid, almost mechanical. He had been trained for this, trained to be patient, to be silent, to be unseen. The world was his for the taking. His mission was clear, and there was nothing else. He was in his element. But then the phone rang. At first, it was just a low buzz in his pocket, barely perceptible over the winds that whipped across the desolate landscape. He didn't think much of it, dismissing it as one of those calls that would be dealt with when he returned to base. He had a job to do. But the buzzing persisted, urgent, insistent. Something in the sound made him pause, made him set the rifle down and take the phone from his vest. He glanced at the screen. It was a local number, a random string of digits. Most calls here were filtered, routed through secure channels. But something about this number caught his attention. He had seen it before. It was the number that only one person had access to. His father's number. His gut tightened. Something was wrong. He pressed the screen, accepting the call, holding the phone to his ear with a calm that belied the growing unease in his chest. He didn't speak immediately, just listened. The connection was faint, and the image that flickered on his screen was grainy, shaky, almost too distorted to make sense of. But then he heard the voice. "Son," the voice on the other end said, the words breaking through the static. "They've pulled him over." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His father, the elderly man who had raised him, the one who had spent years working to provide a better life, was in trouble. His heart rate spiked, the quiet of the desert suddenly feeling suffocating. "They're harassing him," the voice continued, panic creeping into the tone. "They've stopped him, and they're treating him like a criminal. You've got to come back. You've got to do something." The sniper's fingers tightened around the phone, his jaw clenched. The image of his father standing on the side of the road, surrounded by cops, flashed in his mind. He could hear the sirens in his ears, feel the injustice of it all. His father had lived his entire life with dignity, had worked for everything he had, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal by men who didn't even know his name. He felt the familiar anger rising within him, but he pushed it down. His mind raced, calculating options, strategies, thinking through every possible scenario. His training kicked in, compartmentalizing the emotions, focusing solely on the objective. But there was no time for calculations. His father needed him. The call from his father's phone had been no accident. It was a call for help, a cry for someone who could make the world stop, someone who could make the cops understand the gravity of the situation. His father wasn't the type to ask for help, not from anyone, especially not from him. This was different. This wasn't just about the bus or the police officers. It was about something deeper, something that cut to the core of everything his father had taught him about respect, about standing up for what was right. "I'm coming," he said, his voice a calm contrast to the storm that was brewing within him. His decision was final, his resolve unshakable. "Stay where you are. Don't let them do anything to you." He ended the call without another word, his mind already shifting into action. The sniper was used to taking orders, used to being the one others turned to when things got difficult. But this was different. This wasn't a mission with a clear target. It was personal. This wasn't about taking down an enemy or completing an assignment. It was about his father. It was about justice, respect, and honor. In that moment, his mind was consumed with a singular thought. No one was going to treat his father like that again. No one. He immediately reached for his gear, his hands moving with practiced precision, sliding his rifle into its case, securing his equipment, preparing for the journey back. The world outside faded as he focused on the task at hand. His orders were clear: get to his father, fast, and make sure this never happened again. As he left his position, heading toward the base to make his arrangements, his mind wandered back to the lessons his father had taught him. The old man had always been there, always steady, always unwavering in the face of adversity. He had seen the worst of the world, had lived through a history that tried to strip him of his dignity, his humanity, and yet he had survived. He had thrived. He had raised his son with the same strength and resilience. The sniper's own journey had been built on his father's foundation, the lessons of perseverance, the drive for excellence, the need to always stand tall. And now his father needed him. The sniper would move mountains to make sure that he was there, that he could stand beside him when the world tried to tear him down. This wasn't just a call for help. It was a call for justice. His grip tightened on his rifle case as he walked towards the waiting transport. The man who had raised him, the man who had shaped him, was being tested in ways he never should have been. And now, his son was coming to show the world just how wrong it was to ever doubt the strength of the man they had so carelessly mocked. He wasn't coming to save his father from the cops. He was coming to remind the world who his father was. The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity as the officers continued to stand around the elderly man, scrutinizing his every move, as if waiting for him to make some kind of mistake that would justify their actions. But there was nothing. The old man stood still, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of quiet dignity. He didn't flinch, didn't speak out of turn. He simply waited. The officers, however, were beginning to show signs of frustration. They had already found nothing. No weapons, no contraband, no reason to hold the old man any longer. Yet, their pride would not let them admit they had made a mistake. The idea that they could be wrong, especially when it came to someone like him, was simply unacceptable. They exchanged glances, searching for a way to escalate the situation without losing face. But just as the tension was about to break, the sound of a car engine roared to life in the distance. The officers didn't hear it at first, too caught up in their own petty game, too absorbed in their desire to assert dominance over someone they deemed inferior. But the man standing quietly in front of them heard it. He knew exactly what it was: the unmistakable rumble of a high-performance vehicle, the kind that only someone with money and influence would drive. It was the kind of sound that commanded attention, and it did just that. The officers paused, their eyes momentarily shifting toward the horizon. The engine grew louder, its presence undeniable. The car was getting closer. There was no mistaking it now. It was coming for them. The old man's heart raced, but he remained calm. He had been through enough in his life to know that there were certain moments you couldn't control. All he could do now was wait. And wait he did. Then the car appeared on the road. It was sleek, black, and powerful, moving fast as it kicked up dust behind it. The officers' expressions shifted from irritation to confusion as the car screeched to a halt just a few feet away. They didn't recognize it. didn't know whose car it was, but the man inside clearly had some kind of authority. The door opened, and out stepped a tall figure, dressed in a dark tactical suit, his movements precise and deliberate. As the figure approached, the officer's postures changed. There was something about the way he carried himself, something in the calmness of his stride, that made them hesitate. It wasn't just his appearance, it was his presence. This was a man who exuded control, a man who was used to being in charge. The old man's son had arrived. There was no dramatic fanfare, no loud declarations, just a quiet storm of power, arriving with no warning. He walked toward the officers, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. When he reached them, he didn't immediately address them. Instead, he turned his attention to his father, his eyes softening for just a brief moment before the cold mask of professionalism slipped back into place. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low but steady, full of authority. The old man nodded. "I'm fine." The officer stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. They had expected a confrontation, perhaps some kind of resistance from the elderly man. What they hadn't counted on was a figure like this, a man who appeared as though he belonged in a world far removed from the petty conflicts of the street, a man whose presence was enough to change the very air around him. The son turned back to the officers, his voice calm but firm. "You'll release him now." The officers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. One of them, a younger officer with a chip on his shoulder, stepped forward. "This is none of your business," he snapped, his tone laced with arrogance. The son's expression didn't change. "It is now." The air was thick with tension as the older officer, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, took a step back. The younger officer, however, wasn't as perceptive. He puffed out his chest, attempting to assert his authority in the face of this newcomer. But the son wasn't impressed. His next words cut through the air with precision. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" The officer opened his mouth to retort, but the son raised a hand, silencing him. "Let me make it clear," he continued, his voice unyielding. "I am a Green Beret, and I have seen and done things you wouldn't believe. So, you can either walk away from this, or you can escalate it. But know this, I don't need to prove anything to you. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to make sure my father is treated with respect." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The officers, for the first time, were beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. They had assumed that they could bully an old man on the side of the road, that they could continue their little game without consequence. But now, standing in front of them was a man who was not only capable of defending his father, but someone whose reputation alone was enough to make them reconsider everything. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner for guidance. The older officer, however, had begun to piece together the pieces. His eyes narrowed as recognition set in. He had heard rumors, of course, of a Green Beret sniper who had been involved in covert operations around the world, someone with a reputation so lethal that it preceded him. But this was different. This was personal. "I suggest you leave," the son said again, his voice cold and calm, but every word laced with authority. Now, there was a long pause. The younger officer, finally realizing the weight of the situation, took a step back. His pride had been shattered in that moment, as the full extent of the man standing before him became clear. The son didn't need to say anything more. The officers, having no desire to escalate the situation further, turned and walked away, their faces a mix of confusion, frustration, and fear. The son watched them go, his gaze unwavering, his posture rigid. He had done what needed to be done. His father was free. As the last of the officers retreated, the son turned back to the elderly man, his face softening just slightly. "You're safe now, Pops." The old man looked at his son, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You've always been my hero." The son gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't here for heroics. He was here for something far more important, to make sure his father would never again face this kind of treatment. In the aftermath of the encounter, the air seemed to settle around them, but a quiet storm was still brewing. The officers, who had once held the upper hand, now found themselves caught in a web of consequences they never saw coming. Word spread quickly. The old man, who had once been disregarded and belittled, was now a symbol of something far greater than they had imagined. The police department couldn't ignore what had happened. The incident, though seemingly small at first, had become a flashpoint. The moment the son had spoken, everything changed. His words had carried the weight of truth, the truth that the officers had missed entirely. That respect was not a privilege, it was a fundamental human right. The internal investigation that followed was swift and unforgiving. The younger officer, the one who had been so quick to judge, was placed on indefinite suspension. His arrogance, his willingness to assert power over someone he perceived as weak, had cost him more than just his position. It had cost him his dignity. His fellow officers had witnessed the shift in power, and they knew it wasn't just about rank or authority. It was about something far deeper. It was about honor, about the willingness to treat others as equals, no matter their background. As the news spread through the community, the old man's name began to take on a new significance. No longer was he just the elderly bus driver who lived a quiet life. No, he had become a symbol of resilience, of dignity. His story was shared far and wide, the story of a man who had lived through decades of hardship, yet had never let the world strip him of his worth. The mayor, who had initially turned a blind eye to the incident, found himself compelled to act. It was time to address the wrong that had been done, to publicly acknowledge the disrespect his city's officers had shown. He called for a public ceremony, an apology to the elderly man, and a formal recognition of his contribution to the community. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the old man stood at the front of the crowd, his son beside him. The officers who had harassed him were nowhere to be seen, having been removed from duty. Their absence spoke volumes, but it was the presence of the community that made the difference. People gathered to show their support, to offer their respect. They weren't there because of titles or rank, but because they recognized the worth of the man standing before them. The mayor took the stage, his voice ringing out across the crowd. "Today," he began, "we gather to acknowledge something that should have been acknowledged long ago. This man, who has lived a life full of integrity and hard work, was disrespected by those who are meant to protect and serve. But more than that, we gather today to remind ourselves of the values that should guide us all: respect, honor, and dignity. These are not things that are earned through titles or wealth, but through the way we treat each other every day." The old man stood tall, his expression calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight of everything he had endured. He had lived through so much, through decades of prejudice, through moments where his worth had been questioned simply because of his age, his race, or his status. Yet here he was, standing at the center of it all, receiving the recognition he had long been denied. The mayor turned toward him, his voice softening. "We owe you an apology. On behalf of this city, I want to say that we failed you, and for that, we are truly sorry. You deserve far more than what was given to you." The crowd erupted in applause, their claps a testament to the power of recognition, to the power of standing up for what is right. But for the old man, the applause was not the reward. It was the acknowledgement that his life, his dignity, his humanity had finally been seen. As the ceremony concluded, the son stood by his father, watching as the old man was showered with praise and respect. He had done what he set out to do, not just for himself, not just for his father, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than human. As the crowd began to disperse, the son turned to his father, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You did it, Pops. They can't take that away from you." The old man smiled, his expression soft. "No, they can't. But it's not just about me, son. It's about everyone who's ever been pushed aside, who's ever been made to feel invisible. Today, we made sure that doesn't happen again. Not here. Not ever." The son nodded, the weight of his father's words settling in. They had won. It wasn't a victory born out of force or anger. It was a victory of truth, of dignity, and of respect. The son had been raised on these principles. He had been taught that respect was not something to be demanded. It was something to be given freely, to be earned through actions, through the way one lived their life. His father had spent decades proving that very truth, and now the world was beginning to see it too. The officers may have thought they could take away his father's dignity, But they hadn't counted on the strength that ran through his blood. They hadn't counted on a son who had been trained not just to fight, but to stand for what was right. And together, they had shown the world that respect was not a commodity. It was a baseline, a foundation upon which humanity should always stand. And as they walked away from the ceremony, side by side, the son knew one thing for certain: respect had been earned, and no one could take that away. If you enjoyed this powerful story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to expect stories, and share this video with your friends. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and let us know what story you'd like to hear next. Stay tuned for more incredible tales, and thank you for being part of our journey.